Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Charleston, South Carolina. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The year was 1846, when the first rumors began to circulate through Charleston's elite social circles. The Beauregard Plantation, once the crown jewel of South Carolina's aristocracy, had grown unusually quiet in recent months. Visitors, once frequent and welcomed with open arms, were now turned away at the gates by stern-faced servants who offered no explanations. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones about Margaret Beauregard, the widow who had been left to manage the sprawling estate after her husband's sudden passing 3 years prior. The Beauregard family name carried weight in Charleston society. Their fortune, built on the backs of over 100 enslaved people who worked their cotton fields, had secured them a position among the city's most influential families. The late Colonel James Beauregard had been a respected military man, a veteran of the Seminole Wars who had returned home to expand his inheritance and raise a son worthy of the Beauregard legacy. But now, with James gone, something had shifted within the walls of the plantation house, something that caused unease among even the most steadfast family friends. It began with a letter, discovered years later in the personal effects of Elizabeth Harris, Margaret's closest confidant. Dated April 9th, 1846, the carefully penned words revealed the first cracks in what would eventually become a complete collapse. "Dearest Elizabeth," Margaret had written, "I fear I can no longer recognize the person I have become. The thoughts that occupy my mind would shock even the most liberal of our acquaintances. I find myself drawn to places on the property where I have no business being, seeking out interactions that should never occur. James would be horrified. Perhaps I am unwell. Perhaps grief has finally claimed my sanity." County records show that in the weeks following this correspondence, Margaret Beauregard withdrew almost entirely from public life. She declined invitations to social gatherings, ceased attending Sunday services at St. Michael's Church, and was rarely seen beyond the boundaries of her estate. Her 22-year-old son, Thomas Beauregard, a student at the College of Charleston, continued to represent the family name in social circles, though accounts from his classmates suggest he, too, had become increasingly withdrawn and quick to anger. What few knew at the time was that Thomas had begun to notice changes in his mother's behavior that troubled him deeply. According to a journal recovered during renovations of the property in 1963, Thomas documented his observations with growing concern. "Mother has taken a peculiar interest in the management of the field hands," he wrote in one entry dated May 26th. "She insists on personally overseeing their work, something father would never have allowed her to do. Her conversations at dinner increasingly revolve around one particular worker, Samuel. She speaks of his intelligence and demeanor in a manner that makes me profoundly uncomfortable. I fear the isolation of widowhood has affected her judgment." Samuel Turner, the man referenced in Thomas's writings, had been purchased by Colonel Beauregard in 1842. Plantation records describe him as literate, strong-built, approximately 25 years of age. Unlike many of the enslaved people on the Beauregard plantation, Samuel had been assigned duties that kept him closer to the main house. He maintained the grounds, tended to the stables, and occasionally served as a messenger between the plantation and Charleston proper. His relative freedom of movement made him a unique figure among the enslaved population. A report filed with the Charleston Constabulary in June 1846 hints at the escalating tensions within the household. Thomas Beauregard had apparently discovered Samuel on the second floor of the main house, outside his mother's private chambers, well after sunset. The official complaint describes a violent altercation that left Samuel severely beaten. Margaret Beauregard's intervention is noted in the report, with the constable writing that the widow appeared highly agitated and insisted no punishment be administered to the slave in question, claiming he had been summoned to repair a broken window latch. The constable further noted that no damage to any window was observable. The scandal might have remained contained had it not been for the observations of Harriet Wilson, a housekeeper who had served the Beauregard family for over 15 years. In a sworn statement given years later as part of a property dispute, Wilson recounted a pattern of behavior that she found increasingly difficult to ignore. Mrs. Beauregard would send for Samuel at all hours, she testified. At first, the pretext seemed reasonable enough: garden work, moving furniture, carrying messages. But soon the tasks grew thinner, and the time they spent in each other's company lengthened. I once entered the library to find them standing far too close, her hand upon his arm. They separated immediately, but what I had seen could not be unseen. Wilson's testimony continued with details that would have destroyed Margaret's standing in Charleston society had they become widely known at the time. She began to dress differently when she knew he would be working near the house. She wore colors and styles that had remained in her wardrobe untouched since before the colonel's passing. She spoke differently when addressing him, her voice softer, more deliberate. And there were gifts, small items at first, a handkerchief, a book, left where he would find them. By August of 1846, the atmosphere within the Plantation house had become unbearable. Thomas, increasingly convinced of an inappropriate relationship between his mother and Samuel, took increasingly desperate measures to separate them. Plantation records indicate that he attempted to have Samuel sold to a property in Georgia, only to have the transaction mysteriously reversed. Letters between Thomas and his father's former business partners reveal his growing desperation. "I fear for my mother's reputation and indeed her soul," he wrote to one associate. "The grief of widowhood has clearly affected her mind, leading her to form attachments that violate every natural and social law. I implore your advice on how I might remove the source of temptation without creating a public spectacle." The response Thomas received suggested a discreet transfer of Samuel to a plantation much further away, perhaps as far as Mississippi, where the problem might be permanently resolved without drawing unwanted attention to the Beauregard name. Thomas apparently moved quickly to implement this plan, arranging for Samuel to be taken from the property under the cover of darkness on September 3rd, 1846. What happened next is documented in a series of increasingly frantic journal entries by Thomas. "Mother has not left her room for 3 days," he wrote on September 6th. "She refuses meals and visitors alike. When I attempt to speak with her through the door, she responds with silence or unintelligible muttering. The house staff report hearing her pacing throughout the night, opening and closing drawers as if searching for something lost." By September 10th, Thomas's concern had turned to alarm. "Found mother this morning in father's study, surrounded by maps of the Western Territories. When questioned, she claimed to be planning a trip to visit distant relatives, though to my knowledge we have no family beyond the Carolinas. She asked for access to her inheritance, a substantial sum that father had placed in trust. I denied her request, suggesting instead that she might benefit from the company of her sister in Virginia. She looked at me with such cold hatred that I scarcely recognized her." The following weeks brought a disturbing calm to the Beauregard household. Margaret appeared to accept her son's authority, resuming some of her social obligations and even hosting a small gathering of ladies from St. Michael's Church. Thomas, cautiously optimistic, wrote of his hope that the unnatural spell has been broken and that, with time and proper Christian guidance, mother might be restored to her former self. This period of apparent normalcy ended abruptly on October 23rd, when Margaret Beauregard disappeared from the plantation. A note left in her chambers stated simply that she had gone to visit her sister in Richmond and would return when circumstances permit. Thomas immediately dispatched a messenger to his aunt's home, only to discover that Margaret had never arrived, nor had she been expected. The subsequent search for Margaret Beauregard is documented in constabulary records and private correspondence between Thomas and various officials. Inquiries at stagecoach offices and shipping companies revealed that a woman matching Margaret's description had purchased passage on a westbound coach the morning of her disappearance. She had been accompanied by a man described as tall, well-spoken, wearing the attire of a free person of color. The pair had claimed to be traveling to New Orleans on business. Thomas's desperate pursuit led him first to New Orleans, where harbor records indicate he arrived on November 12th. From there, the trail grew increasingly difficult to follow. Partial documentation suggests he continued his search through the winter months, traveling as far west as the Mississippi Territory. A letter sent to a family friend in February 1847 reveals his deteriorating mental state. "I have sacrificed everything, my studies, my social standing, significant portions of my inheritance, in this quest to save Mother from herself. Yet at every turn, I am thwarted." They move like ghosts through these territories, leaving whispers but no firm evidence of their passage. The most troubling document from this period is a sworn statement by a tavern keeper in a small Mississippi settlement who reported that Thomas Beauregard had spent several nights at his establishment, drinking heavily and speaking openly about his intention to kill a runaway slave, who had, in his words, bewitched and abducted his mother. Local authorities, concerned about his increasingly erratic behavior, had advised him to return east before his reputation suffered irreparable damage. Thomas Beauregard did eventually return to Charleston in April 1847, though records indicate he sold the family plantation shortly thereafter. The new owners reported finding the main house in a state of disarray, with many personal items and family heirlooms removed or destroyed. Thomas himself departed for Europe later that year, citing a desire to distance himself from painful memories, according to correspondence with his remaining business associates. For nearly 2 decades, the story of Margaret Beauregard and Samuel Turner faded into obscurity, becoming little more than a whispered cautionary tale among Charleston's elite families. Then, in 1864, as Union forces advanced through Georgia, a Union Army captain named Jonathan Miller documented a curious encounter in his field journal. Miller described being approached by an elderly woman living alone in a remote cabin near the Georgia-Alabama border. The woman, who identified herself only as Margaret, claimed to have information about Confederate troop movements in exchange for protection. Miller noted that despite her isolated living situation and apparent poverty, the woman spoke with the unmistakable refinement of Southern aristocracy and possessed several items of jewelry that seemed incongruous with her surroundings. Most intriguing was Miller's description of a portrait hanging in the woman's cabin, which he described as a skillfully executed likeness of a black man, dressed in the fashion of a gentleman, something I have never before encountered in my travels through the South. When questioned about the portrait, the woman reportedly replied, "My husband, lost to fever these past 5 years, but still watching over me." Miller's account includes a disturbing postscript. Upon returning to the cabin 2 days later with additional troops, they found it completely abandoned, with no sign of the woman or her belongings. The only item remaining was a letter addressed to Thomas Beauregard of Charleston, which Miller confiscated but did not open. This letter was later catalogued among Miller's personal effects following his death at the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain, but its contents remain unknown as the document itself was reportedly destroyed in a fire at the military archives in 1959. The final documented chapter of this story comes from an unexpected source, church records from a small integrated congregation established by abolitionists in southern Ohio. These records, discovered during a historical survey conducted by the University of Cincinnati in 1968, include a marriage certificate dated January 1853 for a Samuel Turner and Margaret Turner, formerly Beauregard. The officiating minister added a personal note that the couple had been living as husband and wife for several years prior, having escaped persecution in the southern states. The same church records contain a death certificate for Margaret Turner, dated September 1859, listing the cause as consumption. She was buried in the church cemetery under a simple marker bearing only her married name and the dates of her birth and death. Samuel Turner's name appears occasionally in church documents for several more years, usually in relation to carpentry work performed for congregation members. The last mention of him is from 1866, noting his intention to travel west to California, where a man might truly live free. Thomas Beauregard never returned to America. Records from a private sanitarium outside London indicate he was admitted in 1871, suffering from persistent delusions and melancholia. The attending physician's notes describe Thomas's fixation on the belief that his mother had been abducted and corrupted through some form of unnatural influence. Thomas remained institutionalized until his death in 1878, leaving no heirs to the once prominent Beauregard name. The Beauregard plantation changed hands several times in the decades following the Civil War, eventually being subdivided and developed as Charleston expanded. The main house remained standing until 1932, when it was destroyed by fire. Investigators determined the blaze had been deliberately set, though no suspects were ever identified. Inside was a collection of letters, written in a refined feminine hand and addressed simply to "My Beloved." The letters, now preserved in the Charleston Historical Society archives, are notable for their passionate declarations of love and detailed plans for escape to a place where we might live openly as equals. The final letter, dated October 22, 1846, the day before Margaret Beauregard's disappearance, contains a passage that perhaps best encapsulates the forbidden relationship that defied the strict social boundaries of antebellum South Carolina. By the time you read these words, I will have secured the means for our departure. In 1967, during construction of a new residential development on part of the former plantation grounds, workers uncovered a small metal box buried beneath what would have been the estate's rose garden. The life I leave behind holds nothing for me now but empty rituals and hollow expectations. You have shown me that love transcends the artificial barriers men create between one another. With you, I have known a happiness I never imagined possible. They will search for us, my son, most desperately, but we will vanish like morning mist before the sun. In this new life, I will no longer be Mrs. Beauregard, widow and plantation mistress, but simply Margaret, a woman who chose love over convention, freedom over security, truth over lies. Historians and scholars continue to debate the significance of the Beauregard-Turner relationship within the broader context of antebellum society. Some view it as a rare documented case of a relationship that challenged the fundamental power structures of slavery and patriarchy, while others emphasize the problematic aspects of any romantic relationship formed within such deeply unequal social positions. What remains undisputed is that Margaret Beauregard's decision to abandon her privileged position in Charleston society, sacrificing wealth, status, and family ties to pursue a forbidden relationship, represents one of the most dramatic rejections of Southern aristocratic values recorded from the period. The enduring silence surrounding her story, with documentation emerging only decades or centuries later, speaks to the profound threat such a narrative posed to the social order of the time. As for the Beauregard plantation itself, local residents have long reported unusual sensations when passing the former estate grounds. Some describe a feeling of being watched from empty windows that no longer exist. Others claim to have heard distant arguments carried on the night breeze, a woman's refined voice raised in defiance, a young man's angry shouts, and beneath it all, the steady, resolute tones of a man determined to claim his freedom. The land has since been completely developed, with modern homes standing where cotton once grew, and where two people from vastly different worlds discovered a connection that would ultimately consume them both. Nothing physical remains of their story except scattered documents in various archives and a single unmarked grave in Ohio. Yet something of their defiance lingers, a whispered reminder that even in the darkest chapters of American history, there existed individuals willing to risk everything for the possibility of love on their own terms. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of this story is not what we know, but what remains forever hidden. The private moments between Margaret and Samuel, the exact nature of their feelings for one another, the daily realities of their life together after escaping Charleston. These intimate details died with them, leaving us with only the external framework of a relationship that challenged everything their society held sacred. And so the story of the plantation widow and the man she chose over her family, her society and her race remains incomplete, a shadowy echo from a time when such a choice represented not just social suicide, but potentially a death sentence. In that incompleteness lies perhaps the truest horror, the recognition that countless similar stories have been deliberately erased from our collective memory, buried beneath layers of propriety and historical revision, their participants silenced not just in life, but in the very record of their existence. The most disturbing documents related to this case emerged in 1966, when a historian researching antebellum Charleston discovered a leather-bound journal in the archives of a former slave trader's estate. The journal, authenticated as belonging to Thomas Beauregard, contained entries from the months following his return from Mississippi. These writings reveal a man consumed by rage, humiliation, and a growing obsession with restoring what he called the natural order. "I have failed in my duty to preserve Father's legacy," he wrote on April 28, 1847. The Beauregard name, once spoken with reverence throughout Charleston, now elicits whispers and averted gazes. Mother's betrayal extends beyond her abandonment of family and position. She has made us objects of curiosity and pity. This I cannot forgive. Subsequent entries document Thomas's increasingly desperate attempts to rewrite the narrative of his mother's disappearance. He spread rumors that she had suffered a mental break following her husband's death and had been discreetly placed in a private asylum. He fabricated letters supposedly from Margaret to family friends, expressing regret for her temporary madness and asking for privacy during her recovery. Most disturbing were his detailed plans to locate and eliminate the source of corruption that had destroyed his family. "I have engaged the services of 3 men experienced in tracking runaways," he wrote in June 1847. "They will proceed westward with descriptions of both Mother and the slave Samuel. Their instructions are precise. Mother is to be returned to Charleston for proper care, while her abductor is to meet with an unfortunate accident during the journey. No connection to the Beauregard name will be established. The tracking party returned empty-handed after 4 months of searching. Their report, preserved alongside Thomas's journal, describes following the trail as far as a settlement in Ohio, known to harbor fugitives. There, they found evidence that the couple had indeed passed through, but had departed upon hearing rumors of pursuers from the south. A sympathetic local, believing the men to be family seeking reconciliation, revealed that the lady and her husband had spoken of continuing to Canada, where American laws would have no reach. Thomas's reaction to this failure is documented in a particularly disturbing journal entry from November 1847. "The shame cannot be erased while they both live. I have resolved to sail for Europe, not as an escape, but as a tactical withdrawal. From London, I will establish connections with individuals who operate across borders without the hindrances of excessive morality. Mother may believe herself beyond my reach, but distance is no protection against a son's determination to restore honor." County records indicate that before his departure, Thomas liquidated nearly all remaining Beauregard assets, converting them to forms that could be easily transported and utilized abroad. The substantial sum, equivalent to several $million in today's currency, would have provided ample resources for an extended campaign of retribution. For nearly 5 years, Thomas's movements and activities remained largely undocumented. Then, in 1852, his name appears in the register of an exclusive London gentlemen's club frequented by former military officers and colonial administrators. A fellow member's diary describes Thomas as a quiet American, possessed of considerable means and a singular intensity that makes one rather uncomfortable in prolonged conversation. He speaks often of a family matter requiring resolution, though details are not forthcoming. It was during this period that a series of disturbing incidents occurred across settlements known to harbor former slaves who had escaped from the American South. In Windsor, Ontario, a fire destroyed a boarding house where several fugitives had taken residence. In Liverpool, a black American man working as a dockhand was found beaten to death, his face reportedly mutilated beyond recognition. In each case, witnesses described seeing a well-dressed white man with an American accent in the vicinity shortly before the incidents. While no direct evidence links Thomas Beauregard to these events, the timing and pattern suggest a methodical search extending across the network of communities that assisted escaped slaves. His journal, which resumes in 1853, contains veiled references to promising leads and narrowing circles, though specific locations and names are conspicuously absent. The most revealing entry comes from August 1853. Word has reached me of a carpenter and his wife, recently arrived in a settlement near Montreal. The description of the woman matches mother with uncanny precision, down to the small scar on her right hand from a childhood riding accident. After so long, the thought of looking upon her face again fills me with conflicting emotions. Will I see remorse, defiance, or worse still, contentment in her degradation? I depart within the week, taking only what is necessary for the journey and for what must follow. Here the journal abruptly ends. The next documentation of Thomas Beauregard's existence comes from the passenger manifest of a ship returning from Canada to Liverpool in October 1853. Ship's medical records note that he was confined to his cabin for most of the journey, suffering from a nervous condition resulting in tremors and acute insomnia. The ship's doctor reported that Thomas repeatedly requested sedatives, claiming to be haunted by a woman's screams. Upon his return to London, Thomas withdrew almost entirely from public life. Financial records show that he made significant donations to the Church of England and to several charitable organizations serving fallen women. In a letter to his former business associate in Charleston, he wrote only, "The matter that has consumed me these past years has reached its conclusion. I find no satisfaction in the resolution, only a hollow peace. Please instruct the family attorney to remove my mother's portrait from storage and have it burned without ceremony." While history has no definitive account of what transpired during Thomas's trip to Canada, a report filed with local authorities in a small settlement outside Montreal provides a disturbing possibility. In September 1853, a cabin on the outskirts of the community was found burned to the ground. The remains of 2 individuals were discovered among the ashes, a man and a woman, both unidentifiable due to the severity of the fire. Neighbors reported that the cabin had been occupied by a carpenter known as Samuel Turner and his wife, who had arrived from Ohio approximately 6 months earlier. Most telling was the testimony of a trapper who had been camping in the woods nearby. He reported seeing a well-dressed man approach the cabin shortly after midnight. The stranger had conversed briefly with the occupants at the door before being invited inside. The trapper, thinking nothing unusual about the visit, had retired to sleep. He was awakened hours later by the smell of smoke, but by then The fire had advanced too far for any rescue attempt. Local authorities investigated the incident as a possible accident, noting that autumn in that region often required indoor fires for warmth, which could lead to tragedy if improperly maintained. The case was closed after minimal inquiry, which was not uncommon for incidents involving those known or suspected to be fugitives from American slave states. Was this the final chapter in the story of Margaret Beauregard and Samuel Turner? The coincidence of timing with Thomas's journey to Canada suggests a connection, though absolute confirmation remains elusive. What is certain is that Thomas Beauregard never spoke publicly about his mother again. He lived out his remaining years in increasing isolation, eventually succumbing to what his physicians diagnosed as melancholia with paranoid features that left him convinced he was being pursued by vengeful spirits. The most haunting document related to this case emerged in 1965 during the cataloguing of artifacts from the London sanitarium where Thomas spent his final years. Among his personal effects was a small wooden box containing a silver locket. Inside the locket was a miniature portrait of Margaret Beauregard, painted during happier days. The portrait had been deliberately defaced, with deep scratch marks across the eyes. On the opposite side of the locket, where one might expect to find a portrait of Colonel Beauregard, was instead a lock of dark hair tied with faded blue thread. Beneath the locket lay a single sheet of paper, yellowed with age. The handwriting, shaky but recognizable as Thomas's, contained just one sentence. "I saw her smile as the flames rose around them, as though at last she had found her hell and recognized it as home." The story of the Beauregard family faded from public memory in the tumultuous years following the Civil War. The plantation lands were eventually divided and sold, with no marker or memorial to indicate the tragedy that had unfolded among its former occupants. In Charleston society, the name became something unmentionable, a cautionary tale whispered to young women about the dangers of allowing oneself to be guided by passion rather than propriety. Yet occasionally, throughout the decades that followed, reports emerged from those who purchased portions of the former Beauregard estate. New owners described inexplicable cold spots in certain rooms of houses built on the property, particularly in master bedrooms and studies. Others reported hearing arguments between a man and a woman when no one else was present, always ending with the sound of a door slamming followed by profound silence. Most persistent were accounts of a particular phenomenon that occurred specifically on warm September nights, the smell of smoke accompanied by a woman's laughter, distant but distinctly audible. Children raised on the property often spoke of the laughing lady, who appeared at the edges of their vision but disappeared when directly observed. In 1952, during construction of a housing development on the last undeveloped section of the former plantation, workers uncovered a small underground chamber beneath what historical maps identified as the location of the original stable building. Inside, they found a collection of items carefully arranged on a crude wooden table: a woman's glove, a silver hairbrush monogrammed with the initials MB, several books with handwritten notes in the margins, and most curiously, a man's shirt with an elaborate embroidered S on the collar. The discovery might have prompted further investigation had the construction foreman not ordered the chamber filled with concrete immediately upon its discovery. When questioned about this decision years later, the elderly foreman would only say, "Some things are better left buried. The past has teeth, and it knows how to use them." The final documented connection to the Beauregard-Turner story came in 1968, when a graduate student researching the Underground Railroad discovered correspondence between abolitionists in Ohio and counterparts in Canada. One letter, dated June 1853, mentioned the unusual couple from Charleston, who had recently departed northward. The writer noted, "Mrs. T speaks often of her son, expressing both sorrow for his pain and determination never to return to the life she left behind. Her husband shows remarkable patience with her occasional melancholy. reminding her that they have purchased their happiness at great cost and must honor that sacrifice by living fully in each day they have been granted together. A postscript added to this letter in different handwriting, dated October 1853, simply states, "Word has reached us of tragedy in Montreal. The hunter has found his prey. May God have mercy on all their souls." Perhaps the most fitting epitaph for this dark chapter of American history comes from a poem found among the possessions of the woman known as Margaret Turner after her death in Ohio. Written in a hand that calligraphy experts have confirmed matches surviving examples of Margaret Beauregard's writing, the untitled verses speak to the complex legacy of choices made in defiance of social constraints. They will speak of madness, not of courage. They will whisper of fall, not of flight. They will paint me monster, not woman, who dared claim her heart as her right. Let them burn every trace of my passage. Let them strike my name from their scrolls. What we built in the face of their hatred, no fire can touch, no hand can control. I chose love in a land built on ownership. I claimed freedom while chains still remained, and if hell is the price of such treason, then let flames be my final domain. These words, never published during her lifetime, now rest in the special collections of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, a quiet testament to one woman who rejected the foundational principles of her society for reasons history can document but never fully explain. Visitors to modern-day Charleston who inquire about the Beauregard family are typically directed to well-preserved histories of other prominent plantation dynasties. Tour guides at historic homes mention them only in passing, if at all. Yet, in certain academic circles, the case has gained renewed attention as a rare documented instance of a relationship that directly challenged the twin pillars of antebellum Southern society: racial hierarchy and patriarchal authority. Some historians argue that Margaret Beauregard's choice represented not love, but a different form of rebellion, a rejection of the constraints placed upon women of her class and era. Others suggest that Samuel Turner, whose voice is almost entirely absent from historical records, may have had complex motivations of his own for participating in a relationship that placed him in extraordinary danger. What remains certain is that their story cuts against the carefully constructed narrative of the Old South, revealing fractures in a system that depended on absolute boundaries between races and rigid definitions of gender roles. In choosing each other, Margaret and Samuel created a rupture in the social fabric that could not be mended, only burned away and deliberately forgotten. The land where they briefly lived their separate lives before finding each other now lies beneath shopping centers and suburban homes. The soil that once absorbed the blood, sweat, and tears of enslaved people now supports swimming pools and carefully manicured lawns. The physical traces have been erased, paved over, redeveloped into unrecognizability, yet something remains, a persistent discomfort that emerges whenever the story is told in full. It is the discomfort of confronting desires and choices that existed despite every social, legal, and cultural mechanism designed to prevent them. It is the recognition that beneath the carefully preserved facade of historical Charleston existed currents of rebellion, not just in organized resistance, but in intimate human connections that defied categorization. For those who study the darker corners of American history, the Beauregard-Turner story serves as a reminder that no system of oppression, however comprehensive or brutal, can fully extinguish the capacity for human connection across its boundaries. That this connection often ended in tragedy makes it no less significant as a testament to the complexity of our shared past. In the end, perhaps the truest horror of this story lies not in its conclusion, a fire in a distant Canadian settlement, a son's possible revenge, a family name erased from prominence, but in the society that made such an ending virtually inevitable. A world constructed so rigidly that love itself became an act of revolution, punishable by death. As for the spirits that some claim still wander the former plantation grounds, a woman's laughter, a man's steady footsteps, a son's angry demands, they remain beyond the reach of historical documentation. Like so much of this story, they exist in the realm where verifiable fact meets persistent legend, where the documented record meets the whispered tradition. What we know with certainty is only this. In 1846, a widow named Margaret Beauregard vanished from her Charleston plantation in the company of an enslaved man called Samuel Turner. They fled north, married in defiance of every social convention of their era, and created a life together that lasted approximately 7 years before ending in circumstances that remain partially obscured by time and deliberate erasure. All else, the nature of their feelings, the daily texture of their shared life, the exact circumstances of their deaths, belongs to them alone, buried beneath layers of history that grow deeper with each passing year. In that private space, beyond the reach of documentation or analysis, perhaps they found the freedom that their world was so determined to deny them.